He had $12,000 in a Denver bank, a gold watch worth more than her land, and enough money to end her suffering in a single afternoon. Instead, he lay on her floor, bleeding, and said nothing. For 5 days, he watched her ration flour by the spoonful and count every log on the fire. He was testing her, and she was about to find out. What she does, Vibikis, when she learns the truth, will tell you everything about who Clara Mallister really is. This channel tells the stories of the West that stay with you, where trust is the rarest currency. Love is built one honest act at a time, and compassion is the only thing that survives the longest winters. The lesson: real character isn't who you are when life is easy. It's who you are when you're down to your last piece of bread, and someone else needs it more. Hit subscribe and never miss a story, like this one, if it reached you somewhere real. And leave a comment. I read every single one.
The man collapsed about 10 feet from her porch. When a hard cough echoed from inside the house, Clara lowered the gun. She stepped into the bitter cold, the wind cutting right through her thin dress. He was face down, wearing just a shirt frozen stiff with his own blood. She nudged his boot with her foot. Nothing. "Mister," she said, kicking a little harder. He barely moved. She knelt down and rolled him over. His face was gray, his lips blue, and a long white scar cut through his eyebrow. His empty brown eyes fluttered open. "Get up," Clara ordered. "I am not about to carry you. If you die here, I have to dig a grave in frozen ground, and I just do not have the strength for it." A flicker of life returned to his eyes. He pushed himself up, fell, and then pushed again until he was on his knees, swaying. Clara got her shoulder under his arm, and the dead weight of him nearly took her down. She dug her heels in and hauled him toward the porch. 20 steps later, her back was screaming when they both slipped on the ice. She grabbed a porch post just in time, her fingernails scraping against the frozen wood. The door creaked open. 12-year-old Hannah stood there, her face a knot of worry. "Mama, no," she pleaded. "Grab his other arm, Hannah Grace." "He could be one of Hardgrove's men." "I said now," Clara insisted. Together they dragged the heavy man inside, and he hit the floor like a sack of feed. Clara slammed the door and shot the bolt. She leaned against the wall, her hands shaking too much to hold the shotgun. 8-year-old Sam stood by the bed, gripping his father's hammer with both hands, his eyes locked on the stranger. "Put that down, Sam," Clara said. "No, ma'am," he replied, planting his feet just like his daddy used to. A lump formed in her throat. "Fine," she said. "Keep it. Just stay close to your sister." A deep, wet cough came from Ellie on the bed. It was the kind of sickness a mother's prayers and remedies could not reach. The 5-year-old seemed to get smaller every day. The stranger lay still, his breathing shallow. A dark stain of blood was slowly spreading across the floorboards. "He is bleeding something awful," Hannah said, her voice flat. Fear had left Hannah about a year ago. Clara knelt and lifted his shirt. A ragged gash 6 inches long was torn deep into his side. It was not a knife wound. It looked like he had been snagged on wire or a sharp branch. She told Hannah, "Get me some cloth strips from the mending basket and the pot of water." "We are wasting water on him?" Hannah challenged. "That is for Ellie's tea. I will melt more snow for Ellie. Now go." As Hannah stomped off, Clara pressed her hand against the wound. The man's body tensed and his hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with surprising strength. His eyes flew open. Clara did not even flinch. She just looked him square in the eye. "Let go of my arm." His gaze was wild, like a spooked animal's. "Mister, you're in my house and my children are watching you. Let go of my arm right now." His eyes finally focused on hers and the wildness faded. His fingers loosened their grip. "Sorry," he rasped, his voice like gravel. "Sorry, ma'am." "Do not call me ma'am," she said. "What should I call you?" "Clara." He took a shaky breath. I am Eli. Eli what? She asked. When he did not answer, she pushed. You got a last name, or did you leave it out there in the snow? Just Eli, he said. A man hiding his name was hiding other things too. Clara knew all about hiding. She had a debt notice for $85 from the bank, a loan her husband never told her about. Hannah returned with the supplies. Clara cleaned and packed the wound, then bound it tightly with strips from her own petticoat. Through it all, Eli just stared at the ceiling without making a sound. He was a man who knew how to handle pain. Clara wiped her bloody hands on her skirt. You will live, she told him. It is an ugly wound, but not deep enough to finish you. Much obliged, he whispered. Do not thank me yet, she said flatly. This storm could last for days. I have 2 logs for the fire, a little bit of flour, and 3 children I can barely feed. You are just one more mouth. He turned his head and looked right at her. I will not eat your food. You will, she countered, or you will die on my floor. And I already told you I am not digging any graves. A tiny smile touched the corner of his mouth. From the bed, Ellie let out a long, rattling cough that shook her small frame. Sam gently placed his hand on her back. Eli's gaze drifted to the sick child. Your girl, he stated. How long has she been sick? 3 weeks, Clara answered. And she's getting worse every day. Have you tried willow bark? He asked. Used the last of it a week ago. He fell silent, his eyes fixed on the children. There is a willow grove down by the creek south of here, he said quietly. About a quarter mile. How could you possibly know that? Clara wondered, but he did not answer. Instead, she went to the shelf and took down a tin. Inside was one hard piece of bread she had been saving. She broke it into 4 unequal pieces. The 3 larger parts went to her children. Hannah took hers without a word. Sam accepted his, then broke off a small corner and placed it gently in Ellie's mouth. The smallest piece remained in Clara's palm. From the floor, Eli's eyes followed the bread as if it were his last hope on earth. Do not, he rasped. That is yours. I know whose it is, she said. She placed the bread on the shelf just above his head, close enough for him to reach. Then she turned her back to him and faced the stove. She did not need to watch. She had made her choice. After a long silence, she heard the faint sound of hard bread being broken and then chewed slowly and carefully. She did not turn around. The fire popped and a weak wave of heat washed over her. It was not enough. It was never enough. Night fell like a lamp being blown out, and the wind returned with a vengeance, making the cabin walls groan. Clara checked the bolt on the door twice. Her children were either asleep or pretending to be. She sat on the floor by the stove, where she could see the whole room, including the stranger. Eli was awake. She could tell by the rhythm of his breathing. You ought to get some sleep, she said into the darkness. Cannot, he replied. Pain? No, just thinking. About what? About a woman who points a shotgun at a man 1 minute and drags him inside the next. Do not make it out to be more than it was, she said. I would have done the same for a stray dog. No, you would not have, he said softly. Clara looked across the room. The firelight caught the side of his face, highlighting the scar and the hard set of his jaw. His eyes were open, and he was watching her. You do not know a thing about me, she stated. I know you split your last piece of bread 4 ways, he answered, and kept none for yourself. You were counting? I count things, he said. The fire hissed, and in the silence that followed, Ellie coughed. That little one needs a doctor, Eli's voice cut through the quiet. The doctor is in town, a good 12 miles off, and the roads are all snowed under. Besides, I have no horse. What happened to it? Clara's jaw set hard. I sold him. Back in October, a man named Harrove hiked the taxes on my land. I owe $42 by January 15th. The horse got me 20. How much have you got put away? That is not your concern. No, ma'am, it is not. The wind howled outside. She pulled her shawl close. $18, she confessed to the dark. Why she told this stranger, she could not say. $18 from 2 years of saving and going without. And I owe Harrove, plus 85 on a banknote my husband left. He never told me about it. Her voice was empty. I've got $18 to cover 127. This Harrove, Eli said, his voice low. Is he the one buying up all the land? Her head snapped toward him. How would you know that? I passed a couple of empty places on my way here. Good land, fences still up. Someone was forced off. Folks do not just walk away from land like that. She stared at the man barely alive an hour ago, now reading the land through a blizzard. Who are you? I told you. My name is Eli. That is not what I'm asking. He just closed his eyes. I know what you are asking, but I am not ready to answer. You are on my floor, she said, her voice sharp. My bandages are on your wound, and you ate the bread meant for my children. I know. Then you owe me an answer. I do, he agreed, his eyes opening. But not tonight. She knew he was not sleeping, same as her. Two souls awake in the dark, each carrying a burden too heavy to set down. Her mind went to the notice in the drawer. 6 weeks. $42 she did not have, and another 85 she could not bear to think on. She saw Harrove at church, smiling at her like he already owned her lock, stock, and barrel. Then she thought of Jim, how she found him at the bottom of the old mine shaft. She had pulled him out herself and dug his grave while the children watched from the porch. Now this stranger was on her floor, another mouth taking what little she had. The fire died to embers and the cold crept in. Clara pulled her knees to her chest. She woke before dawn to a strange sound. Eli was sitting up facing the fireplace. In the faint red glow from the coals, she saw him turning something over in his hands. Metal glinted. In the instant before he tucked it back into his shirt, she saw it clearly. A heavy gold watch, the kind of thing worth more than her entire homestead. Her heart began to pound in her chest, and she squeezed her eyes shut, pretending to be asleep. No drifter carried a piece like that. She lay there, listening to him lie back down, his breathing evening out. The question spun in her mind. Who was this man? And what was he doing half dead in a blizzard with a fortune hidden in his shirt? Sleep was impossible after that. The image of the gold watch was burned into her mind. He was no simple traveler. As the dark slowly gave way to a gray winter morning, she knew the man's torn clothes and empty hands were a lie. He was already awake, just sitting there watching her. She studied him through her eyelashes, pretending to sleep. He got to his feet, slow and stiff from the cold and his injury. He steadied himself on a shelf, his hand brushing the bread tin. He paused, looked at it, but moved on without opening it. At the stove, he saw the last 2 logs stacked there. She watched him take in what that meant, what having only 2 logs meant for a family in a storm. He did not light the fire. Instead, he unbolted the door and slipped outside, pulling it shut tight to keep the cold out. Clara sat up. Hannah was awake too. "Where is he off to?" she whispered. "I do not know." "Good," Hannah said. "I hope he keeps walking." Clara went to the frosted window. In the gray morning light, she saw him limping toward the trees, one hand pressed to his side. He was gathering firewood. For 10 minutes, she watched him break dry branches with his bare hands, stacking them carefully. He came back inside a while later, his shirt soaked and lips blue with cold, but his arms were loaded with enough wood to last 2 days. He built a fire with an expert hand, and soon warmth filled the small cabin. Clara was holding Ellie. The little girl was on fire with fever, her eyes glassy and her breathing shallow. Eli saw the child and stopped his work. "How is she?" The fever came back, worse than before. He stood up straight. "There is Willow down by the creek. I have to go. The storm is not over. It is easing up. The wind has shifted. I figure I have about 4 hours." Clara just stared. "How can you know that?" I have been reading the weather for 20 years, was all he said, pulling on his boots. At the door, he turned. I will be back in 2 hours. If I am not, do not come after me. Just keep the fire hot and the girl warm. You will tear that wound open, she warned. Probably. That is not much comfort. It was not meant to be. And with that, he was gone. He is a crazy man, Hannah said from the bed. Nobody goes out in a blizzard for some bark. He did, Clara said, holding Ellie close. Young Sam appeared at her side, holding his father's hammer. Should I go with him, Mama? No, son. Her voice caught. Your daddy would have gone. But he would have told you to stay right here and protect your sisters. That is your job now. Sam gave a solemn nod and went to sit by Ellie, the hammer resting on his lap, a small man on guard. While they waited, Hannah sat mending a sock, her needle jabbing the wool. Mama, she said finally, that man is not who he claims to be. He has not claimed to be much of anyone, Clara replied. Exactly, Hannah said, biting the thread. A real drifter talks your ear off, tells you his story. He makes himself seem small and harmless, so you will not run him off. This one, he just makes himself useful. And what is the difference? Clara asked, sitting across from her. Hannah looked her mother square in the eye. A man who makes himself useful is a man who means to stay. The words hung in the air. Clara thought of the neatly stacked firewood and the perfectly built fire. You are only 12 years old. How do you know such things? Hannah's hands went still. Because that is what Daddy did, she said, her gaze unwavering. The first time he came to Grandpa's, he did not say a word. He just fixed the porch and split a cord of wood. And waited. Clara's words caught in her throat. This stranger made no sense. Suddenly the door crashed open in a flurry of snow, and Eli staggered inside. His arms were full of pale white bark, but a deep red stain was spreading across his shirt. Though his face was gray with pain, his eyes were clear and focused. He dropped the bark on the table. Pot, he rasped, his hands shaking. Boiling water. Clara brought it, and he dropped the bark in. A bitter medicinal smell rose with the steam. Let it steep for 10 minutes, he said, slumping to the floor. Any longer, she will not keep it down. How could he know that? Lost 40 head of cattle to a fever one winter, he muttered, clutching his bleeding side. Had to learn what the land offers. Clara froze. A drifter did not own 40 head of cattle. She knelt by his side. Let me see that wound. He moved his hand, revealing the blood-soaked bandage. You tore it open, she said. Figured I might, he replied, his gaze fixed on Ellie's small, trembling body on the bed. And you went anyway. He nodded. Yeah, I went anyway. Clara cleaned the gash again, binding it so tight this time that he sucked air through his teeth. She did not apologize. You keep this up, you will get infection. Then I will have 2 people dying on my floor. Nobody is dying, he stated. You do not get to decide that. Neither do you, he shot back, but we can fight it. Clara poured the steeped willow tea and carried it to Ellie, lifting the girl's head. Drink, baby. I know it is bitter. After Ellie sipped some, Sam, her little brother, looked across the room. Is the medicine going to work? Eli met the boy's gaze, serious and direct. It will work. The fever will come down by tonight. You promise? Sam asked. For a moment, Eli hesitated, the weight of making a promise to a child clear on his face. I promise, he said finally. Sam gave a single nod and went back to his sister's side. Clara saw a raw, unguarded look cross Eli's face as he watched the boy, an expression he quickly hid. Do not, Clara said quietly. Do not what? Do not look at my son like that. Like you are seeing a ghost. Eli's jaw tightened. I had a brother. He was your boy's age when I lost him. He said nothing more, and she did not push. As the afternoon wore on, Ellie's breathing eased. The fever held steady but did not climb. The tea was working. Eli sat by the fire, whittling a piece of wood with a small, bone-handled knife. Hannah, Clara's oldest, watched his every move. "You know about cattle," Hannah said. It was not a question. Eli's knife stopped moving. "Some. You said you lost 40 head. That is not some. That is a herd. It was a while back." "How long ago?" Hannah pressed. 12 years, he said, finally looking up from his carving. "A bad winter up north, in Montana." "You owned cattle in Montana," Clara stated, her voice sharp. Eli set his carving down and looked straight at Hannah. "You are smart," he said. "And you want to know if I am dangerous." Hannah did not blink. "Are you?" "Not to you all," he answered. "But that is not a no." "No," he admitted, the honesty of it settling in the small room. "It is not. I have done things I am not proud of. But I have never hurt a woman or a child. And I do not plan on starting in the cabin of the woman who saved my life." Hannah stared at him for a long moment, then walked to the shelf and began mixing a small batch of biscuit dough. "You can have 2, she announced. "Ellie, Sam, and Mama get 3. "What about you?" Eli asked. "I am not hungry." "Yes, you are," he said softly. "You gave your share of bread to your brother last night when you thought your mother was not looking." Clara's head whipped around. "Hannah, you did what?" "He is growing," Hannah mumbled, her face flushing red. "What house, Mama?" she suddenly cried, her voice cracking. "We have 6 weeks before Mr. Harrove takes it. We have no horse, no money, and a stranger bleeding on our floor. I'm 12 years old, and I know exactly how much flour is left in that tin. I cannot stop counting, because if I stop, I will start screaming." The room fell silent. Clara went to her daughter and pulled her hands from the dough. "I know," she whispered. "I am scared, too." That evening, the storm finally broke. The wind died down, and the world outside grew quiet. Just after sundown, Clara felt the change. One moment, Ellie's forehead was burning hot, and the next, the heat began to fade. The little girl's eyes opened, clear and aware. "Mama," she whispered, "I am hungry." Clara buried her face in her daughter's hair and just breathed. Across the room, Eli watched them, that raw, hidden emotion flickering on his face again. He looked down at the carving in his hands, which Clara now saw was a small, perfectly shaped horse. He quietly placed it on the floor by the stove. An hour later, Sam found it. He picked it up, turning the little horse over and over in his hands, before looking at Eli. "Is this yours?" Sam asked. Eli shook his head. "It is yours, if you want it." The hardness in his face seemed to melt away, the first gentle look Clara had seen on him since her Jim passed. "My own daddy used to whittle," Sam said. Eli nodded slowly. "I reckon I know," he said, then corrected himself. "I mean to say, a man who pays close attention makes a fine carver. Your father must have noticed the little things." Sam slipped the little horse into his pocket, right beside the heavy hammer. He didn't offer a thank you, but none was needed. He just climbed back into his bed, one hand clutching the tool and the other wrapped around the carving. Clara held her peace until her children were sound asleep. All 3 of them this time. She sat on the rough floorboards, the low fire crackling between her and Eli. It was banked for the night, but its glow was steady enough to see his expression. "Let me see the watch," she said. His entire body went rigid. The carving knife in his hand stilled. His eyes lifted slowly to meet hers. "What watch are you talking about?" "The gold one," she replied. "The one you were holding last night when you figured I was asleep." The silence hung heavy in the small cabin. A log in the fire popped, sending a flurry of sparks up the chimney. Eli reached into his shirt and his hand came out with the watch. He placed it on the floor between them. The firelight danced on the metal, giving it a warm yellow gleam. It was a fine porcelain face with Roman numerals, the hands still ticking away, keeping time against all odds. That was a good watch, an expensive watch, a timepiece that cost more than Jim had earned in 5 hard years. Inside the cover, she saw an inscription and tilted it toward the fire. ETB. Build something worth keeping. She snapped it shut and set it back down. ETB, she said aloud. Eli T something. What does the B stand for? His face was a mask of shadow and light. He picked up the watch, cradling it in his palm. My father gave me this watch on my 22nd birthday. He told me to go out and build something that would last. It took him 16 years. He had built a cattle empire from almost nothing. Then a man I trusted, he said, his hand closing tight around the watch, burned it all down, not with a match, but with paperwork and lies and a crooked judge. Clara just listened. I won it all back. Every last acre. The courts finally saw things my way. He tucked the watch back inside his shirt. But I lost everyone who mattered. Friends who only cared about what I had. So you just left, she said. I left and ended up here. My horse broke a leg 20 miles east of here. I walked until I couldn't walk no more. He finally looked straight at her. Then a woman with a shotgun found me in the snow and gave me her last piece of bread. Clara felt a tightness in her chest. I need you to tell me the truth, Eli. The whole truth. Your real name, where your money is, and why you are really here. I have 3 children, and about 6 weeks before I lose this home. I don't have time for games and secrets. Eli looked at her across the embers of the fire. This woman who had saved his life, bandaged him with her own clothing, and fed him from her family's meager pantry. Now she was demanding the one thing he had been running from for 2 long years. The truth. His hand went to his chest where the watch lay. Not tonight, he said softly. But I will soon. I give you my word. Your word isn't worth a thing when I don't even know your name. It's worth everything, he countered. You just don't know it yet. Clara pushed herself up, her knees aching from the cold floor. Soon, she said, her voice firm. Not later. Soon. She went to her bed and lay down next to her children. Ellie's fever had broken. Hannah slept the deep sleep of someone who carried the weight of the world on her young shoulders. Sam was asleep with the hammer in one hand and that little carved horse in the other. As Clara drifted off, she heard Eli whisper something so low she almost missed it. Build something worth keeping. The storm finally gave up on the 5th morning. Clara opened her cabin door to a world buried in white and silence. Not a whisper of wind. The sky was a heavy gray, but the snow had stopped falling. Eli was already outside, had been since before sunrise. He had built the fire, hauled water from the creek, and stacked firewood by the door. She had stopped pretending it did not matter. He was down at the north fence line, which had collapsed under the heavy snow. The posts were snapped clean in 2. He was digging out the wire with his bare hands. She could see the thick bandage through his shirt, and he favored his left side, but he never stopped working. 5 days. He had been there for 5 days, and that fence line stood prouder than it had since Jim passed. The chicken coop door, which had sagged for a year, now swung true. The roof above Ellie's bed no longer leaked. The stranger had fixed it all without a single word. Inside, Ellie was breathing easier. She had even eaten 2 helpings of biscuits, her sister Hannah giving up her own portion without a fuss. Clara wrapped her shawl tight and walked out to the fence line, her boots crunching on the icy snow. Eli stood up as she came near. This fence is in a bad way, he said. The posts are rotten clean through. Should have been replaced 2 years back. Clara's voice was like flint. I know when they should have been replaced. He looked at her, but she cut him off. My husband was dying, then he was gone, and I was left alone with 3 kids and a world of things to fix. Eli just gave a short nod and got back to stretching the wire. Clara watched him work. The road to town should be clear by morning, she said. I am out of flour and salt. He stopped his work. I will go with you. No, she said flatly. You show up with me, and tongues will start to wag. Harrove will hear I am taking in strays. Eli turned to face her. He is going to hear something anyway. You think nobody has noticed you have firewood again? The smoke from your chimney tells its own story. The thought struck her like cold water. I will go alone with Sam. I will say I traded mending for the wood. She squared her shoulders. And I will walk right past Harrove with my $18 and 5 weeks left to pay him. The number hung in the cold air between them. 5 weeks. Let me help, Eli said, his voice low. You are fixing my fence, she replied. That is not what I mean. I know exactly what you mean, she shot back, stepping closer. You want to march into town and pay my debt with whatever secret money you are hiding. Would that be so bad? He asked. Yes, she said, her voice as hard as the frozen earth. Because then I would owe a debt to a man who will not even tell me his name. His jaw set hard. Beckett, he said. Elijah Thornton Beckett. The name meant nothing to her at all. My father was Colonel William Beckett. He ran the biggest cattle operation in Montana. When he died, he left everything to me. He twisted a piece of wire in his hands. I doubled its size. I even took on a partner, Marcus Crane, to handle the books. And he betrayed you, Clara stated, not asking a question. He told every judge and banker from here to Fort Worth that I was unstable and violent. He tried to take it all. She looked him dead in the eye. Was any of it true? The violent part, he admitted, his voice flat. Rustlers hit the ranch. I fought back and I hurt them bad. Crane used that against me. Said it was proof I was dangerous. I won the fight in court, but I lost everywhere else. Friends, neighbors, everyone. He dropped the wire. So I sold the whole outfit. I signed the papers and rode south with a gold watch and enough money to buy a small town. Clara's breath caught in her throat. How much money? Enough. How much? She demanded. $12,000? The number was staggering. It was so big it did not seem real. Her own debt was $127. He could pay it and not even feel it. You came to my cabin half dead, she said slowly. No horse, no coat. Looking like a beggar. My horse went lame. I walked until the storm hit, and then I just kept on walking. Why? I was looking for proof, he said, his eyes meeting hers. Proof that one person might help a stranger just because it was the right thing to do. A hot rage built inside her chest. You were testing me. Yes. This whole time you were seeing if the poor widow would help a man who had nothing. Yes. The gold watch he had shown her by the fire. He had known she was awake. Her hand flew, the crack of it hitting his face was sharp in the cold air. He took the blow, his cheek turning red, and faced her again. I deserve that, he said quietly. You deserve much worse, she shot back, her voice trembling. My children went hungry. My son is scared of every shadow. My baby nearly died just feet from a gold watch that could have saved us all. I know. That broke her. You know? And that makes it all right? No. Nothing makes it right. Then why? She cried. Why not just offer to help? Because every person who ever helped me wanted a piece of my fortune, he said, his voice finally breaking. When the money was gone, they all disappeared. I had to know if anyone was real. And I was your experiment. You were my last hope. The words hung there between them. You are a fool, Eli Beckett, she said, the anger still hot. A rich fool who let my family suffer just to prove a point. I am, he agreed. And if you think I will let you pay my debt out of your guilt, not guilt, he cut in. Partnership, equal partners, your land and your hard work against my capital. We build something new, together. I do not need a partner. You need $127 in 5 weeks, he countered. How will you get it? Sell your mother's ring? She went completely still. She had never told him about the ring. "In the drawer by the bed," he said softly, "wrapped in a lace handkerchief. I saw it when I built the fire. You went through my things. The drawer was open. That ring is all you have of your mother. I know it means the world to you." Her eyes burned, but she refused to cry. She had no tears left for this man. "I am going to town tomorrow. Alone," she said, her voice hard. "When I return, you will be gone." She turned for the cabin. "Clara," he called out, "I will go. But first, let me at least leave you the money for the debt." She stopped on the porch, her hand on the smooth, sturdy rail he had fixed himself. "That is not how this works," she said, her back still to him. "You do not get to lie to me and then buy your forgiveness." "Then you tell me how it works," he pleaded. Clara went inside and shut the door. Hannah was standing by the table. She had heard everything. Her face was a storm cloud. "He is rich," Hannah said, her voice as hard as frozen ground. "Yes. This whole time? And he watched us starve?" Clara had no answer, because her daughter was right. "I want him gone. Now, Mama." Hannah's eyes then fell on Sam's pocket, where he kept the small carved horse. A terrible understanding washed over her. "Oh, Sam knows who he is," Clara said quietly. "He just does not care. Someone was kind to him, and that is all that matters." Clara slumped at the table, head in her hands. "Mama!" Hannah's hand was small but strong on her shoulder. "What do we do?" "I do not know, honey." "You always know," Hannah whispered. "Not this time." They sat in silence. Sam was on the bed, making the wooden horse jump across the windowsill. Hoof beats. Clara looked up sharply. "Mama, riders," Hannah said from the window. 2 horsemen were coming up the south road. She recognized Hargrove's big bay horse. "Get the children to the corner," Clara said, her voice low, "and stay quiet." As Hannah moved the children, Clara grabbed the shotgun and her last 2 shells. The door creaked open. It was Eli. "Riders coming," he said, seeing the gun. "I see them." His eyes met hers. "Let me handle this." "This is my land," Clara said. "My fight." Eli paused, then moved to stand right beside her. His shoulder was nearly touching hers. He picked up the hammer from the shelf. "Your fight," he said, "but I am standing with you." The riders reached the gate. A big man on Hargrove's horse dismounted. It was his foreman, Burl Kendrick, 240 pounds of mean. The second man stayed mounted, a rifle across his saddle. Kendrick strode up the path like he owned the place. Clara met him on the porch, shotgun in hand. Kendrick stopped. He stared at Clara, then at Eli. He clearly had not expected to see another man. "Mrs. Mallister, the judge sent his regards." "We are fine." "Good to hear." His gaze stuck on Eli. "Got company?" "Not your concern," Clara said. He reached inside his coat. Clara tensed. He pulled out a paper. "The judge wanted you to have this." "Leave it on the gate post," she commanded. Kendrick's smile was ugly. "No need to be unfriendly." He left the paper on the gate post, gave Eli one last sizing up look, and rode away. Clara waited until they were gone. She walked to the gate and unfolded the paper. Her hands were steady, but her heart was not. She read it twice to make sense of the words. "What is it?" Eli asked. She walked past him into the cabin and sat down. "He moved the date," she said, her voice dead. "The tax sale is December 23rd. That is 3 weeks from now. The day before Christmas Eve." "He cannot do that," Eli said from the doorway. "The law requires a 30-day notice." "You know the law now?" she asked. "It does not matter. Hargrove is the law in this county. He does what he wants." She smoothed the paper flat. 3 weeks. 21 days. Hannah whispered from the corner. Clara closed her eyes. She had $18 against a debt of $127. Let me help, Eli said, sitting across from her. No. Your pride will cost your children this house. The words hit her hard because they were true. Get out, she whispered. No, I am not leaving. This is not your fight. It is now, he said, leaning forward. I am making it mine. I am doing this because your little girl survived a fever that should have taken her, because your son sleeps with a hammer, because your daughter skips meals for him. His voice was thick with emotion. And because you took me in. You gave me food you could not spare. I will not let a man like Hargrove take this place from you. Clara could not breathe. Mama, let him help, Sam said from the corner. She opened her eyes. Her boy stood there, hammer in one hand, horse in the other. Daddy would have let him help. The cabin was silent. Clara looked at the paper, at her children, and then at Eli. She saw something in his face she could finally trust. Partners, she said, the word catching in her throat. Not charity. We are equal partners, or it is nothing. Equal, he agreed. My land and my work against your money, and no more secrets. You tell me everything. Her voice grew low and dangerous. If you betray us, I will find you, and my shotgun will not be empty. Eli held out his scarred hand across the table. It was the hand that had carved the horse. Clara took it, gripping it tight. Hannah walked to the table, placing her hand over theirs. She looked right at Eli. I am watching you, she said. You hurt her, and you will answer to me. Eli almost smiled. I believe you. Sam came and put his small hand on top of the pile. Partners, he said. The cabin felt secure as fresh snow began to fall outside, covering the rider's tracks. Eli was gone before dawn. Clara heard the sound of his horse fade into the quiet morning. Lying next to a sleeping Ellie, she told herself the hollow ache in her chest was just hunger. He had paid for his rental horse with cash from a money belt. A money belt he had worn the entire time he watched her family scrape by. She got up and made coffee, the simple comfort of it feeling like a debt to him. Hannah watched her from the kitchen table. Is he coming back? He said he would. Men say a lot of things, Mama, Hannah said, her voice small. Daddy said he would be back too, that morning he left for the mine. Clara's hand froze on the coffee pot. Now that ain't fair, Hannah, she said quietly. I know, her daughter whispered. I just don't want to see you get hurt again. Clara sat down and put an arm around her daughter's bony shoulders. If he does not come back, Clara said, we will figure it out, just like we always do. And if he does come back, well, we will figure that out too. 3 days crawled by. Eli did not return. The first day, Clara tried to fix the fence herself, her hands bleeding through her gloves. The second day, Agnes Whitmore showed up, a 60-year-old woman as tough as a fence post carrying a basket with eggs and broth. Heard you had company, Agnes said, walking right in. She set the basket on the table, and her sharp eyes took everything in. The extra bedroll, the tools that were not Jim's, the perfectly stacked firewood. Had company, Clara corrected. He's gone. Agnes checked on Ellie, her touch gentle. This child's been taking willow bark tea. Yes. You haven't had any willow bark for a month, Agnes stated. So either you found a tree in a blizzard, or someone found it for you. Clara poured her a cup of coffee. His name is Eli. Found him half dead in the storm. And now he has gone to town, Agnes finished for her. How do you know that? Agnes took a sip of coffee. Because Burl Kendrick has been telling everyone at the saloon that Widow Mallister has a man living with her. And because a stranger bought a good horse yesterday and sent 4 telegrams, paid with silver dollars. Clara felt her stomach turn to ice. Kendrick told people. Kendrick works for Harrove, Agnes said, leaning forward. Of course he told people. Clara needed answers. She had to know who this man was and why he was there. So she told Agnes everything. She talked about the watch, the hidden money, and the name. Elijah Thornton Beckett. She told her about the cattle empire up in Montana, the story of betrayal, and the strange test he was conducting. Agnes just listened, her hands wrapped around a warm coffee cup, not saying a word until Clara was finished. The old woman finally spoke, her voice low. "Beckett," she said. "I remember that name. Colonel Beckett had the largest ranch in the whole territory. But his son, he just up and walked away from it all." Agnes looked Clara square in the eye. "And now he's out there mending your fence. You're trying to figure out if he's the real deal." Clara sighed. "I'm wondering if it even matters. Hargrove has pushed up the date. I have $18 and a notice that says I lose this place the day before Christmas Eve." "That's 12 days from now," Agnes said softly. 12 days. The number sent a chill through Clara. Agnes stood and buttoned her coat. "I've seen Hargrove do this to 6 families, all of them gone, bought out for next to nothing." She picked up her basket to leave. "If this Beckett fellow is who he claims to be and he's offering to help, you let him." "This isn't just for you anymore," Agnes said before closing the door behind her. "It's for all of us." Clara sat alone, the coffee now cold. 12 days. She counted them on her fingers. December 23rd, 9 in the morning, on the courthouse steps where Hargrove and his cronies would take her home. Her son Sam came and sat by her side. He placed his little wooden horse on the table, pointing its nose toward the door. "He'll be back," Sam said with certainty. "You don't know that, honey." "The horse knows," he insisted, nudging it forward. "Horses always find their way home." 10 days later, Eli returned. Clara was carrying water from the creek when she heard the sound of hoofbeats. He rode in from the south, leading a second horse loaded with supplies. A third horse carried a man she'd never seen before, a thin man with spectacles and a fine wool coat. Eli got off at the gate, opened it, and secured it behind him, just like he did the first night. Clara set the heavy buckets down, her whole body aching. She looked at him, a mix of relief and anger bubbling up inside her. "You were gone 10 days, she said, her voice tight. "I know." "You said a few days," she reminded him. "Things took a bit more time than I figured." He nodded toward the man in the fine coat. "Clara, this here is Mr. Aldous Fletcher. He's a lawyer from Denver." The man tipped his hat. "Mrs. Mallister, your partner has explained your difficult situation to me." "My partner?" Clara shot a look at Eli. "Is that what you're calling yourself now?" "It is what we agreed upon. We agreed on that before you vanished for 10 days, leaving me and my children with a 12-day countdown to losing our land." Eli took her anger without a word. He just stood there, holding the reins, letting her have her say. The lawyer cleared his throat. "Perhaps we could continue this inside. I have some papers that need your signature." Inside, Mr. Fletcher laid out a stack of legal documents. The words were dense, but Clara could make out a few. Fraud, appeal, reassessment. "Mr. Beckett hired my firm 5 days ago," the lawyer explained. "I have since filed an emergency appeal challenging the tax assessment on your property. I also filed a formal complaint about some suspicious tax auctions that have been happening in this county." Clara looked from the papers to the men. "What does all that mean in plain English?" "It means Judge Hargrove is in a whole mess of trouble," Fletcher said, adjusting his glasses. "The man who reassessed your land was the judge's own brother-in-law. Your property was valued at 3 times what it's worth, just like 5 other properties that all ended up being sold at auction. And every single one was bought by a company tied to the bank, where Judge Hargrove is the main shareholder." "That part ain't new to me," Clara said flatly. "No, ma'am, it's not. But it is brand new information to the territorial governor. He received my report yesterday, along with a petition signed by 18 other folks from this county who lost their land the very same way." Clara's head snapped up. 18? "Mrs. Whitmore was a great help in finding them," Fletcher said. He almost smiled. That remarkable woman, Agnes, rode for 2 days straight, gathering signatures and statements from all your old neighbors. She told me to tell you that this fight ain't just yours anymore. A lump formed in Clara's throat. She put her hand on the table, feeling the rustle of the papers. "So what happens now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Now," the lawyer said, gathering his documents, "we take this to a court in Denver, a court that Judge Hargrove doesn't own. The appeal freezes the auction scheduled for December 23rd. It cannot move forward." "It can't proceed," Clara repeated the words, letting them sink in. The relief was so strong it made the room spin. Eli's hand steadied her shoulder, but she shook it off. "I'm fine," she said, walking onto the porch to breathe the cold, crisp air. Her land was still her land. Maybe it would stay that way. Eli followed her out, but gave her some space. "You should have told me," she said, her back to him. "You should have told me you were getting a lawyer, and that you spoke with Agnes." "Would you have agreed?" he asked quietly. "That's not the point." "I think it is. You would have refused, said it was charity." She whirled around to face him. "You think I don't know I need help? I have known it every single day for 2 long years. Every morning I wake up, I count what we have left, and the numbers never add up. But I get up anyway. I feed my children anyway. I fix what's broken and I pray because that's all I have." Her voice trembled, but she held it steady. "So don't you dare tell me I need help like it's some kind of revelation. I am living it. The real difference between us is that I've been fighting, while you've been wandering the country feeling sorry for yourself." The words hit him hard, but he didn't look away. "You're right," he said softly. "I know I am. For 2 years, I've just been riding, testing people, looking for something that wasn't there. It was pathetic." "Then why did you stop here?" she asked. "Because you met me with a shotgun. And then you took me in anyway. Because I saw your daughter give her bread to her brother, and I saw your son stand guard with a hammer. Because your baby was sick with a fever, and you still made room for a stranger." He took a step closer. "I stopped playing those games the day you slapped me. Everything I have done since then has been real." "How can I believe that?" "Because," he said, "I brought a lawyer all the way from Denver in the middle of winter to help a woman who just told me she doesn't need my help." Clara looked at him then, really looked at the lines around his eyes and the scar on his brow. She finally saw the man instead of the mystery. It was just plain wrong. And down in her bones, Clara knew this fight was about more than just her land. It was about standing up when you have been kicked down. A person's got to build something worth keeping, even if it starts with a shaky signature and a prayer. If you have ever felt like the underdog, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. The lines around his eyes were etched deep from a hard life. She did not back down. "You got slapped by me," she said, her voice steady. "Right in front of my children." A small, sharp sound escaped her, almost a laugh. She covered her mouth, but it was too late. He saw it. "This is not funny," he insisted. She took a breath. "No, sir, it is not." She faced him. "You have $12,000 in a bank up in Denver. You crawled through a blizzard with it. That sounds plumb crazy." He just nodded. "But you also called us partners," she went on. "Equal partners. My land for your money. We build this ranch together, 50-50. That is the deal. When this is all over, when they finally beat that snake Hargrove, they would build." Eli looked out at her land, at the fences he had already started to mend. He saw what it could be. "We will start with 30 head of cattle," he said. "Hire on a couple of hands. Build a proper barn." Clara leaned against the porch rail, her arms crossed tight. "And you will stay here?" she asked. "If you will have me." He looked around. "I can build a small bunkhouse to sleep in until we figure things out." He paused, his gaze meeting hers. "Clara, I am just asking to be here, to work this land with you." His words reminded her of the inscription on his gold watch, "Build something worth keeping." "My children always come first," she stated plainly. "Before this ranch, before any money, and before you." "I would not expect anything different," he replied. "Hannah does not trust you one bit. She is a smart girl, and will make your life hard." He gave a slight smile. "She already does." Clara's voice went soft. "And Sam? He lost his daddy. He's looking for a man you might not be." Eli was quiet for a long moment. "I know what that boy is looking for. I will not pretend to be his father. But I can be a man who shows up, who does what he says he will do and who does not leave. Does. You already left once," she reminded him. "I came back," he said, turning to face her fully. "And I will come back every time. That is a promise I do not make lightly." The cabin door creaked open. Hannah stood there, her young face telling them she had heard everything. "Mr. Fletcher needs to review the legal papers." Hannah's eyes landed hard on Eli. Then something inside her seemed to give way just a little. "He needs Mama to sign 7 papers." "I'm coming," Clara said. Hannah nodded, then looked back at Eli. "The biscuits from this morning are on the stove. You can have 2 of them." Then she was gone. Eli looked at the closed door, bewildered. Did she just offer me food? "Best not to make a big deal of it," Clara advised. Inside, Mr. Fletcher laid the papers out on the table, explaining each one. Clara listened, with Hannah standing right behind her chair. Clara signed her name 7 times. Her handwriting looked shaky, almost childish. She hated how small it looked on those important papers. Eli watched her but said nothing, just waited patiently. Once she finished, Fletcher packed the documents away. "I will file these in Denver. The judge's freeze order on your property should be active within 48 hours. Judge Hargrove is going to be furious." "Angry men get stupid," Clara said. Fletcher smiled. "That is exactly what we are counting on, Mrs. Mallister. Angry men make mistakes." He tipped his hat and rode off into the cold. 3 weeks ago I was all alone," Clara whispered to the empty window. Eli stood by the stove, holding one of Hannah's biscuits like it was a gold nugget. "You are not alone anymore," he said quietly. From the corner, a small voice piped up. "Mama, I am hungry." For the first time in what felt like forever, a real laugh bubbled up from deep inside Clara. She grabbed the good flour, Eli's flour, and started mixing a new batch of biscuits. Sam sat on the floor, showing Eli the little wooden horse he had carved. He was telling him all about the saddle and rider it needed. Eli leaned in close, listening with his whole heart, the 2 of them planning together. Hannah stood by the window, watching the road, ready for whatever Hargrove sent their way. Her face was set, and her eyes were sharp. She was ready for a fight. Clara's hands kneaded the dough, strong and sure. This was something she knew how to do, making something good from almost nothing. Outside, the snow had finally stopped, and a tiny strip of blue appeared on the horizon. It was not much, but it was enough to know the sun was still there. She put the biscuits in the oven and stood for a moment listening. Her daughter was on watch, her son was making plans, and a man she was just starting to trust was laughing with her boy. They had 12 days until the court date. 12 days until they knew if they would win or lose it all. Clara shut the oven door, pushed her hair back, and got back to work. The courthouse was colder than a tomb. Clara felt the chill right through her boots and the black wool dress she had last worn for her husband's funeral. The dress smelled of cedar and sorrow. It was December 23rd, 9 in the morning. Hargrove had ignored the freeze order from the higher court. He was going ahead with the auction anyway, daring anyone to challenge him. Fletcher had ridden back from Denver in just 2 days, his face tight with exhaustion. He had brought copies of the official order. "He is bluffing," Fletcher insisted. "The order is legally binding. If he auctions off this land, the sale is worthless. He does not care about the law, Clara had told him. He just wants to scare folks into giving up. Now she stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps. A crowd of 30 or 40 people had gathered. She saw Agnes Whitmore looking ready to wrestle a bear. Beside her were other women who had lost their land to Hargrove. They had come back to see this through. Eli was beside her, a quiet presence. He wore a fine three-piece suit, his gold watch chain gleaming. He looked like the rich cattle baron he once was, a man named Elijah Thornton Beckett. For a second he looked like he belonged in a different world, one where people like her did not get pushed around. She hated that suit because it reminded her of the distance between them. "Are you ready?" he asked her. "No," she admitted. "Me neither," he said with a grim smile. Hannah stood on her other side, looking brave in a dress she had nearly outgrown. In her pocket, she held the little wooden horse Sam had given her for good luck. The big courthouse door swung open. A mean-looking fellow named Burl Kendrick stepped out. His eyes scanned the crowd and locked onto Clara and Eli. "Auction starts in 10 minutes," he bellowed. Mr. Fletcher, their lawyer, started up the steps, his briefcase in hand. He looked small against the big building, but he walked with the confidence of a man who knew he was on the right side of the law. Clara took a deep breath. She may have been scared, but she was not alone, and she was not backing down, not today. A lawyer named Fletcher walked up holding a leather case and a sealed letter. He got right in front of Kendrick. "I need a word with Judge Hargrove. The judge is occupied." "Well, I have a court order right here from the territorial bench. It stops all tax business in this county, effective this very minute." Kendrick just stood there like a stone wall. "The judge is occupied." Fletcher raised the letter. "This here is a certified copy. If Judge Hargrove goes on with this auction, he'll be defying the territorial court. You best get this to him right now." Kendrick glanced at the letter, then at Fletcher, then passed him to Eli down by the steps. "You wait here," he grumbled. He took the letter and went inside. The crowd started rustling and whispering. Agnes sidled up closer to Clara. 18 names, she said low. "Every last one of 'em is here today. Widow Johnson, she brought her sister all the way from Pueblo. Even old man Sawyer's daughter came up from Trinidad." Clara looked over the crowd again, seeing faces she'd missed before. Folks who'd lost their own land and homes to the man inside that courthouse. "They really came," Clara whispered. "Of course they did," Agnes said. "This was never just about you, girl." The courthouse door creaked open and Hargrove himself stepped out. He was a big man, thick in the middle with a heavy jaw. His judge's coat was stretched over a vest, a gold watch chain glinting in the weak sun. His face was flushed red and his eyes found Clara in a heartbeat before moving on to Eli and then sweeping over the whole crowd. He held Fletcher's letter in his hand, still sealed. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice carried easy, the sound of a man used to being heard. "I thank y'all for coming out in the cold. This auction will go on as planned." Fletcher stepped up. "Judge Hargrove, I gave your man a certified freeze order. I got your piece of paper, Mr. Fletcher." Hargrove held up the letter. "And I'll give it all the thought it deserves." He set it on the rail behind him without even opening it. "This is a county matter. The territorial court has no say here. That's not correct, Your Honor." "Mr. Fletcher," Hargrove's voice went hard as iron. "You ain't licensed to practice law in this county. This auction is proceeding." Fletcher looked at Clara, his eyes saying what his lips couldn't. "He's going to try and ram this through. Be ready." The clerk came out, a skinny fellow with a thin voice, and unrolled his paper. "First up, the Mallister property, 160 acres. Improvements include a cabin, a well, and fencing. Tax debt of $42 outstanding." Clara felt her chest tighten, the world shrinking down to just that voice. "Do I hear an opening bid?" $50, Kendrick called from the top of the steps, bidding for Hargrove just like always. Clara looked at Eli. He was just watching Hargrove, his face gone real still. Not mad, not scared, but like a man doing hard math in his head. "I have 50. "Do I hear 60? $150. Eli's voice cut through the cold air clear as a bell. Every head turned. Kendrick's jaw clenched. He shot a look at Hargrove, whose eyes were now locked on Eli. "Who's bidding?" the clerk stammered. Eli walked up them steps, slow and steady, and stopped right in front of the clerk. Elijah Thornton Beckett, of the Beckett Cattle Company. He handed the clerk a card. "I'm bidding for Mrs. Clara Mallister, who is the rightful owner. $150 to clear all her debts, the taxes and the banknote held by First National." The clerk's hands started to shake. Hargrove stepped forward. "This auction is for tax debt only. The banknote is your bank's, Judge." Eli's voice never wavered. "The same bank you control. The same bank that's bought up every foreclosed place in this county for 2 years, using fake companies tied to your own family." The noise from the crowd changed, got sharper. "You are out of order, sir." Hargrove's face was turning a dark, ugly red. "I'm a bidder at a public auction. I'm perfectly in order." Eli reached into his coat, pulled out a thick stack of cash, and counted it out for everyone to see. $150. Mrs. Mallister's debts are paid. The auction is void. This auction ain't void till I say so. Under territorial statute, which you know all about since you went to law school in St. Louis and finished third in your class. Eli turned to face Hargrove directly. "I did my homework." Hargrove's mouth snapped shut. "And here's what else I found." Eli reached into his case and pulled out a stack of papers. "Tax records. For every single property in this county. Your own ranch was valued at $1.25 an acre, but Mrs. Mallister's land, which is mighty similar, was valued at $4 an acre. Widow Johnson's was at $3.75. He let the papers drop open. "Your own brother-in-law did every single one of these crooked assessments. Every property with a jacked-up value went to auction, and every auction was won by someone tied to your bank. Then, every piece of land was moved to a holding company." He paused for a breath. "A company called the Western Progress Land Trust, which just so happens to be registered to your wife." The steps of that courthouse went dead silent. Hargrove's hands gripped the railing so hard his knuckles turned white. "These are wild accusations. They're documented facts already filed with the territorial court and the governor's office." Eli placed his papers right next to that unopened letter. "The territorial marshal is in town. He got here last night. Right now he's having breakfast at the hotel, and he is mighty interested in discussing these papers with you." All the color drained from Hargrove's face. "You're bluffing." "I don't bluff. A man who bluffs in the cattle business ends up with no herd." Eli stepped closer, his voice dropping low. "Walk away, Judge. Void this auction. Resign. The marshal will still investigate, but my lawyers won't press for jail time. That's the only deal you're going to get." Hargrove just stared, the fight going out of his eyes. Not just fear, but the awful understanding of a man seeing his whole crooked world fall apart. "You don't know what you've done," Hargrove whispered, his voice shaking. "Oh, I know exactly what I've done. I chose my side." Hargrove looked past Eli to Clara, standing there with her daughter and a whole crowd of folks he'd wronged right behind her. "This isn't over," he said. "For you, it is." Hargrove turned and vanished back inside the courthouse, the door shutting behind him. Kendrick followed without a sound. The clerk was left standing alone, holding cash in one hand and papers in the other. "Auction is suspended," he stammered. "All tax actions are frozen." The crowd let out a roar, a sound of pure relief. Agnes squeezed Clara's arm hard. Widow Johnson was openly weeping. Clara just stood there, her legs feeling like water. Eli came down the steps and stopped right in front of her, looking bone-tired. "It's done," he said. Clara tried to speak, but no words came. "You stood up to a judge," she finally managed. "For all of us," Eli said, nodding toward the crowd of neighbors who had come back to fight. Hannah, who had been quiet this whole time, stepped forward. She looked at Eli for a long moment, then stuck out her hand. Eli took it and shook it, firm and serious. "You still only get 2 biscuits," Hannah told him. A real smile finally broke across Eli's face, like a man who'd been holding his breath for years. "Yes, ma'am," he said. They rode for home in the afternoon sun, Clara on a mare Eli had brought for her. Hannah sat behind, her small arms wrapped tight around her mother's waist. Eli rode beside them. Fletcher had stayed in town to handle the legal paperwork with the marshal. The road was quiet and covered in white, their horses making dark trails in the snow. Clara watched the track stretch out behind them. 2 sets of hoof prints now, where for 3 long years there had been none at all. The ride home was quiet. It was a comfortable silence now, the kind that exists between 2 people who have been through the fire together and don't need words to explain it. As they came over the hill, they saw the cabin, a thin line of smoke rising from the chimney. The fence Eli had fixed stood straight and true. Before they even reached the gate, Sam ran out of the house, his little hammer still in his hand, waving wildly. "Mama! Mama! Ellie ate 3 whole biscuits!" Clara swung down from her horse and scooped him up into a big hug. His cold nose pressed against her cheek. "3 biscuits?" she said with a laugh. She carried him inside, where Ellie was sitting up in bed. The little girl's cheeks had color and her eyes were bright. When she saw her mother, she held up her arms. "Mama?" Clara put Sam down and wrapped Ellie in a warm embrace. The child felt alive and healthy in her arms. She buried her face in her daughter's hair and just breathed, a long, deep breath of pure relief. Hannah was already at the stove putting a kettle on. Everything was going to be all right. They were home and they were together. Clara finally looked at the supplies Eli had brought. Real flour, salt, lard, and coffee beans. A deep calm settled over her, and for the first time in ages, the hard line of her jaw softened. Her hands moved with a familiar, sure speed. Eli lingered in the doorway, half in and half out. Clara looked up at him. "You are letting all the cold in," she said. He stepped inside and shut the door. That night, for the first time in a long while, they ate proper biscuits and gravy. Eli had even brewed coffee, the good kind, dark and strong. Little Ellie sat on Clara's lap, pulling pieces from a warm biscuit. Sam, right next to Eli, was chattering about the wooden horse that needed a barn, a real one for real horses come spring. Hannah, quiet as ever, had set 5 places at the table without anyone asking. 5 plates, 5 cups. Clara saw it, and her heart gave a little squeeze. After supper, Eli went out to the porch. Clara put the little ones to bed, then stepped out into the night air. There were 2 chairs now. She had not had 2 chairs until Eli mended the broken one. She sat, and he sat beside her, the rockers groaning softly on the wooden planks. The sky above was finally clear. The sky was just littered with stars, more than she could rightly count. The cold air bit, clean and sharp with the smell of pine and snow. Eli spoke quiet-like. "Fletcher reckons this court business could take 6 months, maybe more. Those territorial courts ain't in no hurry." "I can wait," she said. "It might get ugly. Hardgroves has friends. I'm finding out I do too." Their rocking chairs moved in easy rhythm, close but not quite touching. "Come spring," Eli said, "I'm thinking of bringing 30 head up from Denver. Start small, see how the land takes to grazing. The grass won't be fit till May. May then. We can build the barn in March if the snow melts early. It won't, never does. April then? Maybe April." They laid their plans just like they did that first night, drawing lines in the dirt on her cabin floor. But this was different. This time those lines felt like they might just hold. "Eli, that watch of yours," she said, "the words on it. Build something worth keeping. My father's words. Good words to live by." He pulled the watch from his shirt, its gold catching the starlight. "He was talking about cattle," Eli said. "The land. Business. What do you suppose he meant?" Eli closed the watch and tucked it away. "I reckon he meant whatever it is you're scaredest to lose." Clara's chair creaked. Inside, Ellie gave a soft little cough. "I was most afraid of losing this place," Clara said. "This cabin, this land, the memory of my folks." Now she looked at him, his shape cut against the stars, the faint scar through his eyebrow. "I'm afraid of more these days," she said softly, "which I suppose means I have more that's worth keeping." Eli's hand reached across the small space between them, finding hers on the armrest. His palm was rough and warm. She just let it be there. Two hands resting together in the night air. From inside, Sam's sleepy voice mumbled, "Mama, the horse needs a name. Go back to sleep, Sam. But it needs a name. You can name it in the morning. Can I name it Eli?" A quiet settled on the porch. Clara looked at Eli and saw that open, unguarded look he couldn't ever seem to hide around her kids. "You can name it whatever you want, sweetheart," Clara said. "Eli. The horse's name is Eli." The boy's breathing settled into the easy rhythm of sleep. Eli's hand tightened on hers just enough. "I ain't going anywhere," he said, his voice low and sure. "I know," she answered. "Not tomorrow or next month. Not when the snow's gone or the court case is over. I know. This porch, this chair, this hand," he gave a gentle squeeze. "This is where I want to be." Clara looked out at her land. Their land. The fence stood tall and the gate was latched. Snow laid a clean white blanket over everything the way it does. Like the world gets a fresh start each winter. Like the worst of what's happened gets buried under something quiet and pure. "Then stay," she said. The stars wheeled overhead. The cabin held its warmth, the fire banked for the night, low and steady. It was the way Clara did everything, careful, patient, and made to last. On the porch, two chairs creaked together. Two people held hands against the cold. And inside, three children slept safe in a home that was theirs. Tomorrow would bring work, fences to mend, a barn to plan, and a future to build from dirt, sweat, and just plain stubbornness. But tonight, there was just this: two chairs, two hands, and a sky full of stars. Clara breathed in the cold air, smelling pine and a little bit of coffee from the kitchen. For the first time in 3 long years, the breath she let out didn't hurt. A story like this one stays with you. Not because it has a perfect ending, because nothing ever does. It stays with you because you saw a little of yourself in it. Maybe you've been Clara, sharing the last piece of bread you had. Maybe you were Eli, walled off because you forgot how to trust. Or maybe you were Hannah, just 12 years old and carrying the weight of a grown woman. Or you were Sam, a hammer in one hand and a little wooden horse in the other, just waiting for someone to stay. We've all sat on a porch at night, wondering if being kind was still worth a damn. This story doesn't have all the answers. It just sits with those questions, the way Clara and Eli sat together in the dark, not needing answers, just needing each other. Thank you for listening. And if you've ever given your last piece of bread to a stranger, or been that stranger who needed it, I hope you know it mattered. It always does. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.